Welcome back to Chapter 22, Part 4. Here we're going to look at the role of hybridization in the formation of species. I know you might be thinking that hybridization stops species from becoming more and more different, and maybe it brings them together. And actually, you're not too far off. That is a possible outcome. So let's take a step back, review the concept of hybrids and what goes on when two species meet in location where their populations overlap, and then start thinking about what some of those outcomes might actually be. So the first concept here is the concept of a hybrid zone. A hybrid zone is any region where the members of two different species actually do mate and produce hybrids. The hybrids that result from that mating between those two different species, often that happens because the reproductive isolating barriers, right, those barriers aren't fully in place over evolutionary time yet. So here's an example of a hybrid zone, and this happens in these really cool toads in Europe and Asia. And there's these two populations. We've got the population of the yellow-bellied toad, and we have the population of the fire-bellied toad. And there's this thin zone right here where the populations overlap. You might just think that's a border line between them, but we really are talking about a hybrid zone. In the regions where the red line is, right here you can see it, this is a hybrid zone. They are, in fact, matings between red-bellied toads and fire-bellied toads in these geographical regions. So it is a very long border, very long hybrid zone, and they do breed together in those locations. But also very interesting to note that as you go from the yellow-bellied toad range to the fire-bellied toad range, for example, if we're following the path this way, then the frequency of the alleles changes dramatically, so that you can see they really are different species. The frequency of the big B allele, for example, is very high in the yellow-bellied toad range, but the frequency of the big B allele is very low in the fire-bellied toad range, and through this hybrid zone it just drops off precipitously. So they really are isolated from each other, but they do have this narrow range of hybrid zone. Hybrids often have reduced fitness, as I've said before, compared to the parental species. And the distribution of hybrid zones can be very complex if the parent species are found within patches within the same region. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's not always quite so simple as the example given with the toads. So let's take a look at the hybrid zones between black-capped chickadees and Carolina chickadees. And so what we see here is a very swift change in hybrid zones between these, because in North America, the black-capped chickadee and the Carolina chickadee, their population locations are shifting northward with warming climate. So the Carolina chickadees are moving farther north, but so are the black-capped chickadees. So hybrid zones can be affected by the changes in environment that we're seeing these days. Another example can be seen in the ranges of the flying squirrel. There's a northern flying squirrel and a southern flying squirrel. And so what we were seeing is that the southern flying squirrel's as population, its range is shifting northward, and it's kind of starting to overlap more and more with the northern flying squirrel's range. So these hybrid zones can shift, and that definitely makes the study of hybrid zones even more and more complicated. And again, this is being driven these days by rapid changes in the environment due to global climate change. So if we have this interbreeding that occurs in these hybrid zones, what we get is new alleles being introduced to the gene pool of the species involved, right? Gene flow. Sometimes this gene flow can be very helpful. It can allow the species to survive in changing conditions, but oftentimes the alleles that are introduced are not very helpful and can be detrimental to the adaptation to the environment that they're used to living in. Okay, so if you look at a hybrid zone and you take a look at this zone over time, and here we're talking about, quite a bit of time here. We're not just talking about a year or two. Over evolutionary time, there are three basic outcomes that can happen when two species have a hybrid zone where you've got these hybrid babies being born. And those three things are, number one, reinforcement. We'll go over that in all three of these in detail, but the main term here is reinforcement. You can have fusion of species, which I just talked about briefly before, and you can have stability. So let's take a look at each of those and see what happens within a hybrid zone. Now, we're going to just take a step back and think about the beginning of the species, and then we'll take it back to what happens when the hybrids form. So think about this as a single population or three separate populations that have gene flow between them, okay? And then imagine a barrier to gene flow happens. Again, this barrier can be due to geography, or it could be due to some intrinsic situation like sexual selection or habitat isolation, whatever it is that's causing this group of populations here to become isolated from each other. So these two still have gene flow between them, but this one is isolated. So what happens over time, of course, is what we've just talked about in this lecture. The ones that are isolated from each other become genetically diverged from each other till a certain point occurs where they're so genetically diverged that, that they're completely different species. But what happens if we don't get to out here, right? We don't get to this point yet where they're completely different species, then there's no chance of reproducing. What happens if at some point along the line, we do have a hybrid zone that develops? And so this is the hybrid zone, and each of these dots is a hybrid individual. What happens in this case? Again, I gave you three options, right? The three options were reinforcement, which you see here, fusion, which you see here, and stability, which you see here. Let's go through each of those one by one and explore the outcomes. For reinforcement, this occurs when the hybrids are less fit than the parent species. Like maybe they don't reproduce as well, right? Go back and think about what happens, like we talked before, when hybrids form, or post-zygotic barriers to reproduction. So, but the hybrids are less fit. What happens with reinforcement is that the natural selection starts acting against those individuals that are less fit. Again, remember that the definition of fitness is the ability to reproduce. So we're not talking about here strength or intelligence or anything like that. We're talking about the ability to reproduce. So if they're less fit, then that means that natural selection is reinforcing the barrier so that they're less and less and less likely to form hybrids. And eventually the hybrid formation just kind of trickles away. It just kind of disappears because these two species are no longer mating with each other because the reinforcement, those offspring, they're just not having as many babies themselves. And so the reproductive barriers become very, very strong. It turns out that if this happens for sympatric species, species that evolved in a sympatric speciation, we do expect that those reproductive barriers would be stronger for sympatric species than for allopatric species. And the reason for this is because 40 probably had some reinforcement going on over time in a sympatric species. But with allopatric species, right, it just might not happen as quickly. So again, reinforcement is strengthening of reproductive barriers. If you've forgotten what the reproductive barriers are, go back to the first part of this lecture and review those 5 prezygotic and 3 postzygotic reproductive barriers. The second thing that can happen to a hybrid zone is fusion. And fusion happens when gene flow between two populations is, well, it's not weakening the reproductive isolation. It's actually weakening the reproductive barriers. So those two things are kind of opposite. It's weakening the reproductive barriers, which means that the two species are fusing together. And if the two species are fusing together, they actually become a single species. Remember that I just talked to you about this before when we were talking about the cichlids in Lake Victoria. This is happening because of water pollution. And so this reduced ability for females to figure out if it's the same species or a different species is causing them to actually, become the same species. The third possible outcome for reproductive isolating mechanisms is stability. And stability was seen in the frog example. So if hybrids continue to be produced over and over and over again, then the hybrid zone will remain stable. It doesn't mean that it becomes the same species. It just means in this region of overlap that those hybrids, they're going to survive. They're going to produce offspring. They're going to produce it in the same amount that the parental type reproduce and have offspring and have, viable offspring. So why does this stability happen? Well, it turns out that in that hybrid zone, the surviving and reproduction of those hybrids is usually pretty good. But the hybrids might be selected against if they leave the hybrid zone. So if we go back to this frog example from before, the Bombina example, where we were looking at the narrow hybrid zone, if you imagine one of those hybrids kind of going into the yellow-bellied zone or the red-bellied or the fire-bellied zone, then they're not as well adapted to that. And if they're not as well adapted to that, then they just kind of die out. And if they die out outside of the hybrid zone, but are fine within the hybrid zone, then you have stability. Well, that's actually all that I have for you for the outcomes of hybrid zones. But we will finish up this chapter as we think about time in the role of the process of speciation in part 5 of this chapter. See you in a minute.